Free trade is dead. There have been some very loud voices screaming this for a while, and to be honest, until recently, I didn't take this very seriously. It makes for a good headline, and certainly generates clicks, but free trade seems like it's here to stay after 3 decades. But then, I started looking into how the end of free trade might occur, and if it was going to, and I started to be more open to the idea that it was possible. And I started to think that the semiconductor industry is what is most likely going to kill free trade. Semiconductors have been in the news a lot lately, but I'm not talking about the recent AI craze that drove chipmaker stocks into a frenzy in early 2023. I am talking about all of the news about reshoring the chip industry away from Taiwan to the United States and other countries. Today, Taiwan produces 90% of the world's most advanced processor chips. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing, one of the largest chip makers in the world, is pouring $40 billion into a new facility in Arizona, aiming to crank out about 600,000 wafers per year. This is not being done for cost savings or other purely economic reasons. Indeed, it will not be cheaper to produce wafers in Arizona. This monumental production shift for one of the most valuable items to our modern economy is occurring because the governments and massive corporations that need those chips learned from the supply chain disruptions of the pandemic and are worried about rising geopolitical tensions doing the same. There is no guarantee of peace for Taiwan. War breaking out in the Middle East, the invasion of Ukraine, rising economic instability and tensions between the West and China are leading companies like Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing to take concrete actions to mitigate the risk of another massive supply chain disruption. They are seeking to ensure their survival with help from Western countries in the event of a conflict with China. If you like this kind of analysis, please help this channel out by subscribing and liking this video. If you want to help support the work I do, please consider subscribing to my Patreon, link in the description. The $280 billion CHIPS and Science Act of 2022 includes $52 billion in subsidies to coax companies into building production plants in the US, and chip-making corporations in Taiwan have been more than receptive. On the surface, this change seems like smart business to reduce that kind of risk. I certainly have been one to advocate for reshoring the manufacturing of certain products critical to our modern lives. But this dance along multiple fine lines is very risky and expensive, with the prospect of peace and tranquility actually being the biggest risk. This video is a bit of a departure from some of the previous statements that I've made about the CHIPS Act and the potential for reshoring chip manufacturing. I've come out in favor of this in the past, and to be clear, I am still in favor of this. I am making this video to point out some of the risks that may be associated with this project. And when I look deeper into the matter, I see a couple of ways that this could potentially backfire. It may not end up being good for Western companies. It will likely not be good in absolute terms for consumers, and it will almost certainly increase costs. And in the event that we don't have a decoupling of the Chinese and Western economies, it may make chips produced in the West non-competitive in global markets. Because of the hundreds of billions of dollars that Western governments and chip manufacturers are investing, and the intimate connections between these multinational corporations and national interests, it is my opinion that a wave of trade protectionism is coming. This new wave won't be limited to semiconductors, although it will start there, and it has the potential to reorder trade on a global scale. We may see the power of the World Trade Organization completely eroded. I hate to admit it, but some of those loud screaming voices might be correct. The era of free trade could be coming to a close. Tariffs on foreign-produced chips are probably in our future, and they're probably here to stay. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing, or TSMC, is the canary in the coal mine here. They are by far the largest producer of the most advanced chips that are the lifeblood of new technologies like artificial intelligence and are vital for all of the advanced military weaponry so obscenely on display over the last 2 years. The U.S. military-industrial complex, Apple, and NVIDIA are the largest customers of TSMC, and it makes sense that in order to ensure the future of the company, TSMC would think about some degree of geographic diversification in the case of conflict between Taiwan and China. That is why last year, TSMC announced a plan to invest $40 billion to construct 2 chip fabrication plants in Arizona. But problems are already starting to rear their ugly heads. The first factory was supposed to begin making chips in 2024, but in July of 2023, the company said that it would delay the production schedule to 2025, citing problems finding skilled workers that they needed. But in reality, the problems go beyond labor shortages. First, despite the AI craze that drove the stock price of TSMC's largest client, Nvidia, through the roof, in July, TSMC lowered its financial guidance for the year, forecasting a decline of 10% year over year in revenue, citing weak orders in nearly all technology product categories outside of AI chips. TSMC is a lot more than just AI chips. If chip revenue doesn't rebound, TSMC will not have the orders to fully utilize this $40 billion factory, making the need for immediate opening for this Arizona factory a lot less urgent. AI alone isn't going to save the day. Second, this venture by TSMC is also not one driven solely by economic needs. There are some rather serious subsidies laid out in the CHIPS Act that are supposed to smooth the way for any chip maker looking to move operations to the US. Policymakers passed this legislation last year in the hopes that it would spark more investment in a domestic chip-making supply chain. But so far, the US government has yet to disperse subsidies from the CHIPS and Science Act. Third, it's kind of sad to say this, but even TSMC executives realize that the biggest risk to reshoring the chip-making industry is peace. If worst-case scenarios don't materialize, what we have is 2 separate supply chains. One of those supply chains is going to be a lot more expensive, and if the market for semiconductors continues to be globalized and free trade survives, the chips produced in that supply chain will not be competitive. Morris Chang, the founder of TSMC, is a supporter of U.S. efforts to slow China's progress in chip production. However, Chang recently warned that globalization, at least in the chip sector, is dead, and raised concerns that the U.S. move towards onshoring and friendshoring, a trade practice where supply chain networks are focused on countries regarded as political and economic allies, has placed free trade in the sector in danger and could lead to the price of chips increasing significantly. If you give up the competitive advantages of Taiwan and move production to the United States, the first thing that's going to happen is that the cost is going to go up. TSMC estimates that U.S. costs would be 50% higher than Taiwan, and that might be an underestimate. China has lagged about 5 or 6 years behind Taiwan in terms of the most advanced chips they can produce. If reshoring happens like we want, there will be an increased split in the supply chain between China and other countries, especially at the leading edge of technology. But just because Chinese manufacturers are behind Taiwan today, and there's a growing split between economies that look west and economies that look to China, there is no guarantee that technology in China will lag. They may catch up quickly, and China may never invade Taiwan. And ironically, that best case scenario for humanity, no invasion of Taiwan, would be a very bad scenario for TSMC and other Western-oriented manufacturers. China could be producing products that are just as good as Western-made ones at significantly lower prices. The $280 billion CHIPS and Science Act, with its $52 billion in subsidies, is likely just the beginning of U.S. investment in trying to entice chip makers to move manufacturing to the United States. Other governments will follow suit, and the eventual investment in reshoring is likely to top $1 trillion worldwide over the next decade. In the event that the West manages to create an entirely separate and likely non-competitive semiconductor supply chain that is still vital to national interests and invests $1 trillion into it along the way, you can bet that trade protectionism is going to rear its head. Governments won't be willing to give up what they see as a vital industry, and they won't be willing to see all the money they invested in those companies get flushed down the drain. The first steps in dismantling free trade have already been taken with the CHIPS and Science Act. The financial incentives, subsidies, and grants to encourage domestic semiconductor manufacturing may be seen as unfair trade practices by China, and the United States is likely to end up in World Trade Organization arbitration. As manufacturing of chips moves away from Taiwan to places like the Netherlands and Japan, those countries as well, in an effort to protect their own investment in chip manufacturing, might also begin to see these practices as unfair and take court action. As part of promoting national security, the CHIPS Act has already led to stricter export controls on critical semiconductor technology, limiting its availability to foreign countries. This could be seen as a form of trade protectionism, as it restricts the flow of technology to international markets. The U.S. government is already using these acts as leverage in trade negotiations by linking them to trade agreements or imposing tariffs on countries that don't comply with certain conditions. The government is also using this act to justify discriminatory practices that favor domestic companies over foreign ones. The act requires certain percentages of domestically sourced components in government contracts, effectively excluding foreign suppliers. This all adds up to trade protectionism, and it may end up breaking a lot more than just free trade and globalization for the semiconductor market. If history is any guide at all, this is an infection that will spread. Before I get accused of trashing America, it's important to note here that none of this happened in a vacuum. Beyond just geopolitical uncertainty, the more I look into free trade, the more I realize that it was kind of a mirage, despite how much it changed the world in the last 30 years. There have always been unfair trade practices, and the one that most concerns the United States is the absolute and total disregard by China of laws regarding intellectual property rights and forced technology transfer. To say that Chinese companies steal technology and intellectual property and market it as their own is not a controversial statement. It is a cold, hard fact. To say that the Chinese government has ignored global concerns about IP theft is also not controversial. It's like they don't even view it as a crime. Some of what is in the CHIPS Act is long overdue measures to protect intellectual property and technology. In my opinion, imposing stricter regulations on the transfer of technology or knowledge to foreign companies is completely warranted after 40 years of intellectual property theft. While the CHIPS and Science Act is a vehicle to strengthen the U.S. technological ecosystem with the primary objective to enhance national security and competitiveness in critical technology sectors, the unintended result may be to stifle international trade well beyond semiconductors. And based on the way the provisions of this act so far have been implemented and the response overseas, that appears the direction we are heading. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.